Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree, and today I'm making a very sad, bittersweet video because we're remembering Radio Shack. But Radio Shack, for reasons I will get into, is a bittersweet memory, unfortunately. So, I'm not going to get into the corporate history of Radio Shack because I wasn't there, and I'm not going to research it because I don't give a shit. I'm talking about my experiences with Radio Shack and broadly speaking, what the common experience would have or could have or should have been with Radio Shack throughout its later years, the 80s, the 90s to the 2000s, and then the end of the road. And I'll touch on why I think Radio Shack failed as a business and where they went wrong. So Radio Shack was an electronics retailer, mostly exclusive to shopping malls, but they did also have some locations outside of malls in shopping centers. What we have today, the strip malls we have today that have replaced shopping malls. But they were mostly centered in your shopping mall or your downtown area. So Radio Shack was an electronics store. Now, Radio Shack, as an electronics store, sold a lot of stuff that you couldn't get anywhere, literally anywhere else. Now, they sold the same stuff you could get everywhere else. TVs, radios, stereos, VCRs, record players, tape players, CD players, Discmans, Walkmans, etc., headphones, your general stuff. They also sold batteries. They sold batteries nobody else would sell. Everybody sold AA, AAA, 9-volt. But Radio Shack was selling all the different little obscure batteries that you needed for different side projects nobody else was selling. Radio Shack was also selling, accessories and components for these different things. So whereas if you would go to Kmart or Sears or, whatever, you would find a all-in-one home stereo, all already in a box. You would take it home, plug it in, turn it on. At Radio Shack, you could buy individual components. You could buy an AM/FM receiver. You could buy a stereo equalizer. You could get a dual cassette tape deck recorder. You could get a standalone record player, CD changer, etc. Individual components. You could also buy individual speakers of various sizes and qualities. 6x9s, two ways, subwoofers, etc. For the largest part of their existence, this was the bulk of their business, electronics devices and things. They also sold computers, but they sold their own brand of computer. They had a brand called Tandy, so they sold the Tandy family of computers and electronics. They also sold the Atari video computer system and the Atari Pongs in their stores, but they didn't sell them under the Atari brand. They rebranded them as Radio Shack properties. Sears did the same thing. They did not do this with Nintendo, Sega, PlayStation, etc. So, missed opportunity, or they knew how to pick their battles, whatever you want to say. Now, this is all fine and well. If you went to Radio Shack, you knew you could buy a TV there. You could buy speaker wires or coax cable, RCA cables, etc. You could buy those TV switches that were necessary to hook your Ataris up to your TV, your Pongs, your televisions, etc. You could also buy universal remotes or replacement remote controls for your TV, VCR, etc. You could buy, floppy disks and flash drives and SD cards, etc., storage for your computer products. You could buy some video games, some video game accessories, controllers, consoles, etc. But really what you were there was for the components. You were there for the individual components you could not get anywhere else. You could buy fully assembled RCA cables at Kmart, but Radio Shack sold the plugs, the actual male and female plugs, and the individual wires, and the individual rubber, hoses that the wires would go in, the casings. They would sell the clips. They would sell, straight up pure copper wire and soldering kits and soldering irons and all the individual components. They would sell individual registers, individual computer chips, individual pieces of RAM, individual components, like pieces that you could go to Radio Shack and buy all the parts necessary to go home and assemble your own computer, your own stereo, your own, two-way radio, or whatever, walkie-talkie, whatever. You could build your own whatever you wanted from parts at Radio Shack. Radio Shack was a parts house as well. And they were the only one doing this. Sears did not do this. Kmart did not do this. Nobody else did. Now, there may have been mom and pop shops that did to a degree. Circuit City, Best Buy, to some extent also. But it was pretty much Radio Shack's business. This was their bread and butter. You could go there to buy cables you couldn't get anywhere else, like Y cables and couplers and things like that. Why is this important? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let's say you had a TV set manufactured in, let's say, 1990. It has one RCA plug in the back, and it has one coax input in the back. Now, you have an SNES that uses RCA outs. You have an NES that uses RF out, a Sega Genesis that uses RF out, and you have a VCR. Maybe you have a brand new HQ VCR that has RCA outs, but you only have one RCA input and one coax input. How in the hell are you going to hook up all these devices? Now, today, you'd buy a TV switch, a box that has multiple inputs and one output, and you would hook it all into that RCA component. But we didn't have those things yet. That didn't exist yet. That came later. So your solution was to buy Y cables and get crafty. And you would daisy chain your RF switches, because each one had an input and an output, because the expectation was you would hook your antenna into your NES input, and then you would hook up the NES output into the TV input, so you could still turn the NES off and watch your TV, or, your VCR, or whatever. So this was, it was complicated, but we lived with it. We did what we did. So sometimes you had to buy couplers and RCA cables and RF switches, and you had to buy, Y cables. So you could have multiple RCA yellow cables going into one Y cable and one yellow out, multiple red cables going into Y cables going into one, red out and one white out, etc. Now, eventually, the industry would figure out how to make like I said, the TV switch, and those would later we would get HDMI hubs, etc. But we weren't there yet. HDMI hadn't been invented yet because HDTVs hadn't been invented yet outside of Japan. And even when they first came on the scene, they were using DVI and component cables. DVI was your digital solution component, composite cable. No, component cables. Component cables were your analog solution. Component cables are the RCA cables that are the multicolored ones. They still have the yellow, red, white, but they also have the orange and the blue. And somewhere along the lines, S-video existed, but we don't talk about S-video because that's a whole video for its own topic. That's a whole topic for its own video. That's so convoluted, it's complicated and messy. Because it gets confused with SVHS, which is not the same thing, but you have to explain it to people, and I don't want to waste your time in this video. I've already done that elsewhere. I'll do it again when I do a whole video on S-video cable. Because it's fucking convoluted, and it pisses me off. Thank you, eBay, for being a piece of shit, by the way. Anyways, Radio Shack was a really great place to get all this stuff. Until about 2005. What happened in 2005? Well, by this point, the home computer market had pretty much shifted. So, Tandy was no longer a thing. Radio Shack was no longer making home computers. They got out of that business. And they were slowly getting out of the hardware manufacturing altogether. So, you were no longer getting Radio Shack receivers and VCRs, etc. You were now getting, Sony or Panasonic or whoever. branded products. Sanyo, JVC, Toshiba, whoever, whatever it was. But also, around this time, the cellular phone became a big thing. Started to really come on the scene in 2003, but by 2005, it was like pretty much standard. Everybody had a cell phone. What happened was, slowly but surely, Radio Shacks turned into cell phone kiosks, more or less. They would still sell TVs and DVD players and, some of your cables and components and stuff, but the selection was diminishing year after year. So if you were going to Radio Shack to get couplers and Y cables and, soldering equipment and registers and individual, what are those things called? The little battery-looking things that go on your computer, whatever they're called. Those things. If you were going there to get individual components, you were SOL. They weren't selling it anymore. Or if they were only selling the best sellers, the greatest hits. So the more rare stuff was harder to find or not carried at all. Up to a point, Radio Shack required their retail salespeople to have college educations. They had to have at least some knowledge of radio equipment and electrical engineering, etc. They didn't have to have a bachelor's degree in, engineering, but they had to have some college experience. However, once they shifted to where they were basically a Sprint store, more or less, with a few components on the side just for, good measure, if you will, or, nostalgia's sake. Well, we haven't sold all this stuff off, so we're going to keep selling it until it's gone. They dropped that requirement. Now it was, you could just have a high school diploma and work at Radio Shack. The reason why I mentioned this is because the retailers went from being experts in electronic equipment to experts, air quotes, of cell phone plans and Wi-Fi and data plans. Basically, in the 90s and the 80s and the 70s, you could go into a Radio Shack, and if you had complex questions on how to assemble this stuff or what part you needed, they were trained. They could help you out. But from 2005 on, unless you were asking what SIM card do I put in my cell phone, they didn't know what you were speaking gibberish to them. If you went into Radio Shack in 2009 and said, yeah, I'm looking for an RCA-Y cable, they were like, can you speak English, please? I don't know what that is. And so you had to go fucking find it yourself. My experience with Radio Shack was pretty much from, I would say 2007 to the end, miserable. It went from being the place to go to the place you dreaded going. I went from getting excited to go to Radio Shack to dreading it. Well, I have to go to Radio Shack because I need this component piece that Best Buy won't sell, Walmart won't sell, Sears doesn't exist anymore, so if they sold it, they're not there anymore, so I have no choice but to go to Radio Shack, find out they don't even have it, or dig through their drawers and see if maybe they have it, but they don't know where it is because they don't know shit. And once I find out I'm SOL, then I got to go to eBay or Amazon or whatever and buy it from Newegg because Radio Shack sucks. And this only exasperated or accelerated as time went on. Later years, like the last 2 or 3 years they were in business, they were just a Sprint store. They no longer sold TVs and Blu-ray players and none of that shit. They were just a Sprint store. It was like, no, we know who our business is. We're a cell phone store. Then they didn't look any different from any other T-Mobile, Sprint store, AT&T store, etc. They were just a cell phone kiosk. And they fucking sucked at that point. At that point, it was like, well, if I'm going to buy cell phone stuff, I'm going to go to the T-Mobile store because I have a T-Mobile phone. I'm not going to buy shit from you guys. And you'd have to be a damn fool to own a Sprint phone. And I know this because I fucking did. My first cell phone was a Sprint piece of shit. And it was one of the biggest mistakes I ever made in life was going with Sprint over anybody else. Fuck Sprint. So yeah, and then, you know, Radio Shack didn't even make it to the pandemic. They went out of business just before the pandemic hit, so we can't even blame the pandemic on their going out of business. We can blame their going out of business on upper management being stupid, forgetting who their customer base was, and chasing after a market that was oversaturated. It was like, well, if you're just going to sell the same stuff the AT&T store sells, I'll go to the AT&T store because they got better stuff and better prices and more knowledgeable retailers. I'd rather talk to somebody that knows their shit than some dumb kid with a high school diploma who's like, I don't know, this is the best phone plan you want. I didn't ask you about phone plans. I said, does this Blu-ray player have, internet connectivity or not? I don't know. What's a Blu-ray player? Why don't you get Netflix or Roku? Har, har, har. Fuck you. Those last 3 or 4 years going into Radio Shack, I'm not exaggerating. I left every time wishing I had punched the retailer in the face. And usually after I was red-faced from yelling at them for being stupid. Why the fuck would you work at Radio Shack if you don't know what a transistor is? Why the fuck would you work at Radio Shack if you don't know the difference between an MC card, compact flash, and SD? Well, this phone uses micro SD. That's all you need. Har, har, har. Fuck you. No, it isn't. I don't need micro SD for my desktop computer or for my camcorder. You dipshit motherfucking dumbass. I don't miss Radio Shack. I miss the Radio Shack of the 90s, but I don't miss what Radio Shack became. When I found out they were going out of business, I hadn't shopped there in so long. I was like, I didn't even know they were still around. Good fucking riddance. Goodbye. Leave me alone. Not even rest in peace. Just eat shit and die. Thank you for nothing, Radio Shack. Fuck off. Like I said, this video is going to be bittersweet because I have tremendously fond memories of Radio Shack from the 90s and nothing but animosity from 2005 on. Just pure hatred for every asshole that worked at Radio Shack, every asshole that ran the company, and every asshole that did business with them. Fuck you. And if you personally worked at a Radio Shack, I want to know, what was the qualifications for working there? Were you just a Sprint store employee, or did you actually know your shit? Leave me a comment down below. And if you knew your shit, were you a leftover employee? And were you, like me, frustrated with the kids who didn't know shit that they were hiring? What were your experiences like shopping at Radio Shack in the 70s, 80s, 90s? And did that change from the 2000s on? Were you glad they went out of business because they turned into something you could no longer stomach? Or were you sad that they were no longer something you could get excited for? Let me know. Stay cool.